Hey everybody, welcome on our channel. In this video we are gonna see, what if Naruto was the guiding flame and got Harem Korra and Asami? Part 1. Huge shout out to the TheEgoRaptor for this story. If you are new on the channel, don't forget to subscribe our channel and like the video too. So without wasting any more time, let's start the story. It had been many decades since Iroh, the famed dragon of the West, had set foot in the material world. His physical body had long since died and he had chosen to live on in the spirit world, becoming somewhat akin to a spirit himself. The spirit world had become his home and the spirits that inhabited its strange lands his friends. Throughout the time he had spent in the spirit world, Iroh had seen many a strange occurrence, though he had become accustomed to it, the strange happenings around him had long since stopped surprising him, now only brining a sense of wonder and awe. He was not prepared however to return to his small tea house to find a young man face down in the grass next to his large tea table, his clothes a tattered mess and a small pool of blood forming underneath him. Even in his extremely confused state, Iroh still had the awareness to know that the boy needed his help. Upon cursory inspection Iroh noticed almost immediately that the young man was in fact a flesh and blood human, meaning that he would have had to have entered the spirit world physically. The only way Iroh knew of to accomplish this was via either of the two spirit portals on the south or north pole, but the wizened old man knew that both portals had been closed for eons. Iroh quickly dismissed the thoughts, the universe was a truly amazing and unknowable place, it was not for him to say what was possible or impossible. The old firebender hefted the young man into his arms, taking note of his unusual bright blonde hair and strange facial markings, and hurried inside. After over an hour of checking the boy over for injuries, Iroh found nothing singularly life-threatening, but the multitude of smaller injuries would have spelled the end for him had the old man not found him when he did. When he was tending to the boy he found something odd. There was some form of spiritual presence within the boy himself, and if Iroh had to guess, it was straining to be released from whatever bonds held it. The boy's Kai was also extremely chaotic, almost as if it possessed a mind of its own. It was churning and writhing within his body, though Iroh's trained senses could feel the utter calmness yet potential for uncontrollable elemental force within his Kai. It seemed whoever the boy was, he was a bender. Iroh brewed a fresh pot of tea, grabbing a cup for himself as he sat by the young man's bedside, his body now almost completely covered in bandages. Iroh decided to spend the time waiting for the boy to wake up by continuing to monitor the boy's Kai. It would be 3 long weeks before Iroh's silent vigil proved fruitful. It was at the beginning or the second week of the boy's slumber that Iroh first noticed the fox spirit perched atop the young man's chest. At first Iroh wasn't quite sure how the spirit had managed to get there without him noticing. He knew it was a spirit because of its unusually strange appearance. It sported 9 bushy tails where a normal fox would only have 1. The shape of its front appendages was more akin to that of a man than a beast. It had extremely long ears for its small size, and its face sported distinct black markings. Iroh knew that the longest he had left the boy's side was only a few minutes at most, but there the spirit sat, content with staring straight into the old man's eyes. It was a few hours after the fox's first appearance that Iroh noticed something different about the boy. The spiritual presence that had been within him was now gone, and Iroh could only assume that the fox that was now acting as a silent guardian had once resided within the boy, though for what purpose he could not determine. The end of the second week brought much desired knowledge for Iroh. The fox began to speak. "Who are you?" It questioned him, the sudden sound of its incredibly deep voice, making him jump somewhat. Iroh recovered quickly, offering a small bow of respect towards the fox beard. "My name is Iroh," he replied with a warm smile adorning his face. "And I would very much like to know yours, great spirit." The fox had smiled at that, showing its large canines. "I think I'm going to like you," it said, "but I don't think you've earned the right to know my name." It explained with no small amount of haughtiness, though Iroh had spent enough of his life dealing with Zuko to realize the falseness of the fox's tone. "Of course, your name is you own to keep," he replied graciously, and the fox gave a small nod of thanks. The room descended into silence for only a few moments before the spirit spoke again. "Where are we?" it asked, and Iroh knew immediately that it was referring to itself and the boy it sat atop. Iroh gave a small laugh before answering. "You, my friend, are guests in my humble tea shop here in the spirit world." The fox spirit's eyes widened somewhat at the statement, and for the first time in days it moved from its perch on the young man, moving towards the nearest window. It propped itself up on the windowsill and craned its neck to look outside. "So this is the spirit world," Iroh heard it say, though only barely. "The old man always used to talk about this place," it said, a sense of maintained wonder in its voice. "If you don't mind me asking," began Iroh, "who is the boy?" he asked politely. The fox spirit quickly returned to its former seat. "His name is much the same as mine. It is his to give and not mine," it said stubbornly. Iroh could only give another small nod of acceptance. The spirit met his eyes with a serious look on its surprisingly human-like face. I take it from the nearly 3 weeks of peace and quiet as well as your lack of cautions that we were alone in our coming here? It asked, piquing Iroh's interest. Yes, he replied, I found only the boy when I was returning home. He explained curtly. I see. The fox spirit said. I suggest you give the area around your home a thorough inspection for any other signs of life or disturbance. Iroh frowned somewhat at the strange suggestion. Are you expecting me to find someone? He asked and the fox shook its head slowly. Quite the opposite in fact, I'm praying you find nothing. It said solemnly. Iroh had done as he was asked, finding nothing until he searched the immediate area where he had found the boy. Underneath his tea table he was greeted with a grisly sight. A strangely off-color right arm, flakes of long-dried blood, had crusted underneath the appendage, though the limb itself showed no signs of decay. He bundled the limb in a cloth and presented it to the fox spirit. I found only this, right next to where I found the boy. He announced as he carefully placed the package at the spirit's feet. The fox extended one of its hands and unwrapped the arm, its eyes widening slightly before its face returned to a neutral expression of calmness. This is good, it said, but I think I'll be keeping this safe. It said, grabbing the appendage with one incredibly dexterous tail and seeming to force the limb into its own body. The arm soon disappeared within the spirit and it seemed to grow to at least twice its original size, now standing as tall as one of the other fox spirits Iroh had seen within Wan Shai Tan's library. Iroh had not questioned the strange side as it seemed a fairly personal matter for the spirit. The next few days were spent in quiet conversation with the spirit, its mood somewhat more amicable after Iroh had offered it a cup of tea from his prized teapot. Their conversations had turned more to the informational side of things as the spirit began to ask more and more questions about Iroh himself and what the fox called the new physical world. What the spirit meant by new eluded Iroh, but he let such thoughts leave him, it was none of his concern. The boy's health however was. What is wrong with the boy's Kai? He asked a spirit, causing it to raise an eyebrow slightly. Where we came from, the boy didn't have Kai as you know it. He possessed a different type of energy within him. Our arrival here upset that delicate energy system, and I was forced to convert his remaining energy into the Kai you know otherwise he would have been poisoned from the inside out. Explained the fox. Iroh could only nod his head slowly. Who was he to question the spirit, it clearly knew what it was doing whilst he had no knowledge of the subject. What will happen to him once the imbalance is corrected? He wondered aloud, the fox was quick to respond. I'm not exactly sure, but if I had to guess I assume he will become what you would call a bender and have mastery over his element. What element would that be? Iroh asked, and the spirit gave a small shrug in response. Air more than likely, he did have an affinity towards that element before. Said the fox, causing a smile to form on Iroh's face. Another airbender, that is marvelous. Perhaps he can help correct the imbalance in the world. With so few airbenders alive today, they would welcome him happily. That drew a raised brow from the fox. What happened to the airbenders? The last time I was here with the old man there were hundreds of them living in their ridiculously placed temples. It asked. Iroh's mood turned somber almost immediately. Or. He said, leaving it at that. It appeared that one simple word was all the explanation the spirit needed. It too hung its head slightly in what Iroh could only assume was a small sign of mourning. I know the terrors of war well enough Iroh, it is a shame to know that the most peaceful of your world's inhabitants were the ones to face annihilation. It is gladdening to know at least a few survived. Said the fox, pausing for only a moment before continuing. Anyways, I fear I have expended too much of my energy by altering my companion's energy network, and keeping my vigil. You seem trustworthy enough Iroh, I will sleep for now. Wake me when he does. It said, gesturing to the boy beside him. Iroh nodded, a small smile upon his lips. I thank you for your trust spirit, his needs one will be met in your absence I assure you. He said. The fox nodded softly before lying down and resting its head in its hands. Only a moment had passed before the spirit was already well and truly asleep. Not knowing how long he may have to wait, Iroh did the only thing he could to center himself for whatever conversation would arise when the boy woke up, he went to make another pot of tea. Naruto hadn't felt this tired in a long time. Not since his rigorous all-day training sessions with Jiraiya had he felt quite as sore as he did now. Despite the physical ache he could feel, there was also a strange feeling of weightlessness accompanying it. His eyelids felt extremely heavy, so much so that it was a great effort to even be able to squint. All he was greeted with for his effort was the sight of a generic wooden roof. He tried to move his arms, but they refused to respond. Even his toes were adamant in their static behavior. His memory was hazy. The last thing he could remember was the mere moments after he and Sasuke had sealed Kaguya. When the sealing process had been completed, out of nowhere, Madara Uchiha had made one final appearance after Kaguya's possession of his body had ended. Sasuke had been too weak at the moment of his reappearance to be of any help, so Naruto took it upon himself to take the initiative and attack first. But the golden Rasengan swirling angrily in his palm, he had dashed towards the man that had taken so much from the alliance. It had been unnecessary, however. When Naruto had been only meters from striking Madara, old man Hagoromo warped into existence between the Child of Destiny and the Curse of Hatred personified. The sage had lifted both arms, with one palm facing Madara and the other facing Naruto. He had seen the sage mutter something, and it was only now that Naruto had time to sift through his most recent memories that he realized it had been a single word. Sorry. And then his world had exploded with light. For the life of him, Naruto couldn't figure out what the old man had to be sorry for. He'd done nothing but help Naruto. Naruto soon returned to trying to move at least some small part of his body. It was then that he noticed something was wrong, very wrong. Since Naruto had broken the seal binding him to Kurama, the Bijuu's familiar presence had been very noticeable, his energy never truly leaving Naruto. Even when Madara successfully extracted the half of Kurama that resided within Naruto, there were still small traces of the Bijuu's power within him. Naruto began to panic as he now felt absolutely nothing. The realization brought with it more than a few terrifying thoughts. Foremost of these was the possibility that he was dead. His alarmed mind quickly saw the sense in the thought. He was brought out of his motionless panic attack by the sound of something shattering against a hard floor. Through sheer force of will he managed to open his eyes enough to see a rather portly old man who had dropped what appeared to be the remnants of a teacup onto a wooden floor. At first Naruto didn't notice anything immediately strange with the scene until he noticed he was looking down on the man from a decent height. He managed to move his head to the side slightly and his eyes widened for a moment when he noticed he was laying horizontal well over 2 meters in the air. The sudden realization of his strange position caused whatever force that was suspending him in the air to vanish completely, causing his body to flail about comically and crash onto a thin mattress below him. The sudden jolt of activity seemed to kickstart Naruto's body. He now found it relatively easy to move himself into a seated position. He gazed at the old man who was only just now moving himself to sit on a small cushion by the bed. Hey," said Naruto as he scratched the back of his head slightly, a look of pure embarrassment on his face. His easygoing attitude seemed to put the old man somewhat at ease. "I must say, I've been around for a long time, I've traveled the far reaches of both worlds, and I have never seen anything quite like that, young man," said the old man between chuckles. Naruto blushed under the praise. Thanks, I think. I'm not really sure how I did that. I've never woken up in the air before to tell you the truth," he said. "It must be your bending. While you were sleeping you must have subconsciously used airbending, though I've only ever heard legends of an ancient airbending guru who could, well, fly," answered the old man. Naruto could only give the man a deadpan expression. I understood some of the words you just said, but the rest of it made no sense." "What's airbending?" he asked innocently. Naruto nearly jumped in fright as the old man began laughing loudly. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry, young man, I forgot you don't know anything about bending. I suppose we'd better wake up your friend, I think it best that he explain this to you," replied the old man. Naruto stared at him in puzzlement for a moment. "What friend?" he finally asked aloud. The old man smiled and gestured towards the strikingly familiar shape of a 9-tailed fox, sleeping soundly in the corner of the room. "Kurama," he called out loudly, causing the fox to jump awake suddenly. When Kurama realized what was happening he gave a low growl. "Damn it, brat. Would you have to go and yell my name out like that?" Naruto stared clueless at his old friend for a short moment before realizing what he meant. He glanced back at the old man who was still sitting on his small cushion, a wide smile now marking his worn face. "What? Were you trying to do the whole mysterious monster act? You cannot know my name, mortal," laughed out Naruto, his voice taking on his best impression of Kurama towards the end. The fox growled once again, which only caused Naruto to laugh even harder. "Now listen here, you little brat," started Kurama, though he didn't have a chance to say any more because Naruto's laughter reached its peak. "What's so funny?" yelled Kurama. "You're calling me little," started Naruto, his laughter interrupting him mid-sentence. "Take a look at yourself, Kurama, you're smaller than Akamaru now," he finished, earning yet another growl from his lifelong friend. "Fine," said Kurama as he turned his back on Naruto. "I guess you don't want to know about bending then, or where we are for that matter." His last statement caused Naruto's laughter to abate rather quickly. Fine. I'm sorry, alright. I really want to know what this bending stuff is, it sounds really cool," said Naruto, trying to placate Kurama as quickly as possible. Iroh could only laugh at the relationship displayed between the two. A young man and an incredibly powerful spirit made a strange duo. Kurama huffed slightly in annoyance before beginning his explanation. "There are 4 types of bending, one for each of the primary elements. Firebending is the pyrokinetic ability to control fire. Waterbending is the hydrokinetic ability to control water in all of its forms, and I think you can see where I'm going with this," said Kurama, giving Naruto time to think over his words. Bending differs from ninjutsu in the sense that it does not require specific hand signs. Also, a bender can only bend one element that is genetically unique to them. Naruto sported a slightly puzzled look on his face. "That's cool and all, but what does it have to do with me? How can I airbend?" he asked. "Before we arrived here your chakra nature was wind. Chakra does not exist in the form you know it here. I had to forcibly convert your chakra into Kai, the energy used here to bend. It was only natural that your wind-natured chakra would become air-natured Kai, thus making you an airbender," explained Kurama. His explanation only served to leave Naruto with more questions. "What do you mean by here? Where are we?" Kurama only sighed. "No longer in the ninja world. It seems the old man saw fit to send us here, to the spirit world." Kurama easily saw Naruto's irrational side beginning to emerge and quickly headed it off. "No, we're not dead, brat. The spirit world is named for the beings that inhabit it, spirits. I can't begin to explain why the old man sent us here, but it would not have been without reason," he said, calming Naruto visibly, his mood quickly turning sour. "There's no way to get home, is there?" he said somewhat dejectedly. Kurama shook his head sadly. "No. Only my father knew how to get here from the ninja world, there is no way for us to get back now," he said softly. Iroh truly felt for the boy. To be taken from the only world he had ever known only to be thrust into another was not something Iroh believed he would like to experience. He felt it was his place to try and cheer the boy up somewhat. "Not all is lost, my boy. You may be in the spirit world now, but the spirit world itself is connected to a world much like your own, I imagine. You could make a life there, free from any worries of your past," he said, drawing Naruto's attention. The blonde in question managed a small smile. "I guess you're right," he said. Iroh could easily see the boy trying his hardest to bury any negative emotions within himself before his mood brightened visibly. "We never really had a proper introduction, did we, old man?" He laughed before extending a closed fist in Iroh's direction. "Naruto Uzumaki," he exclaimed loudly. "Pleased to meet you." An ear-to-ear grin split his features, and Iroh guessed the meaning of his gesture rather quickly. He bumped his own fist against Naruto softly. "Iroh, my boy, and the pleasure is all mine, I assure you. It's not every day I get to meet someone as interesting as yourself," said Iroh, a small smile adorning his features. Iroh was astounded at how quickly the boy was able to bounce back from such a daunting scenario. His sadness had quickly turned into excitement. "Are you a bender too? Oh, maybe you could teach me some wicked new moves, I'm going to have to get a hang of this airbending stuff sooner or later," he said rather quickly, causing Iroh to chuckle lightly. "I'm afraid that there isn't much I could teach you about airbending, Naruto. You see, I was a firebender before I decided to stay in the spirit world. I would only be able to teach you the basics of the airbending form, things I picked up from my time with Avatar Ong," he replied. Naruto seemed immediately hooked on his words. "Who's that? He sounds pretty cool. Maybe he could teach me?" asked Naruto. Iroh shook his head slightly. "I'm afraid Ong's time in the material world came to an almost 20 years ago. A new avatar has taken his place," he said. "What's the avatar?" was Naruto's next question. For the next few hours, Iroh was in deep conversation with Naruto, trying to explain to him the concept of the avatar cycle. It seemed the boy was smarter than he looked, soaking up the information with glee. Their conversation eventually led to the topic of the White Lotus and how it was their duty to guide as well as protect the avatar, helping them to bring balance to the world. It wasn't long before Naruto expressed his interest. "I've decided, Kurama, we're joining the White Lotus, it sounds awesome, plus their goals are kind of like mine, world peace," he announced, causing Kurama to snort softly. "Fine, it will give us something to do at least, but we aren't doing anything for a while," he said. "Why?" complained Naruto. Kurama only rolled his eyes. "Because we are staying here for a while," he said. His statement caused Iroh to raise a brow slightly, he couldn't understand why the spirit would insist on staying in the spirit world. Naruto groaned in response. "How long?" he asked petulantly. Kurama's answer was simple and to the point. "For as long as it takes from Iroh to teach you the basics of firebending." The next morning saw Iroh and his guests outside his humble house. Naruto was pacing back and forth, deep in thought, and Kurama was sitting lazily on his haunches in front of the boy. Iroh had to admit he was shocked to say the least when he heard the spirit's plan the night before. "Let me get this straight," said Naruto, the sound of his inquisitive voice bringing Iroh out of his own personal machinations. "You want to fuse with me, not hop inside me again like always?" he questioned. Kurama sighed in slight annoyance. "I've already explained this, Naruto. When we arrived here I had to change your chakra into Kai because if I didn't it would have slowly killed you." I was made of pure chakra, what do you think would have happened to me? I had to convert my own energy into Kai as well, which has pretty much made me a spirit now, albeit a very powerful one. I always did have an affinity towards fire, it seems I kept it when I became a spirit," explained Kurama. "I can't just hop back inside you because the seal holding me there has been completely dissolved, I would have no anchor in your body," he continued. Iroh felt it only right for him to interrupt. "I take it that you know what will happen once you fuse with Naruto's own spirit, Kurama," he interjected. Naruto seemed confused by his statement. "Boy, Kurama, what does he mean by that?" he asked his friend. "He means you will become like the Avatar, though you will only gain the ability to bend the element of fire, not all 4 elements. Also you will, technically become immortal," said Kurama, his voice trailing off slightly towards the end. Despite his voice quieting, Naruto still heard Kurama loud and clear. "Immortal? What's that supposed to mean? I don't want to live forever," he yelled out. "Naruto my boy, what Kurama means is that your spirit will be reincarnated after your death much like the Avatar. Your spirit would be able to act as a guide for your next life," explained Iroh, hoping to put Naruto at ease. It appeared to work though he still seemed skeptical. "So kind of like old man Hagoromo's kids, Ashura and Indra?" he asked as he turned his attention back to Kurama. The fox shrugged slightly. "Kind of, but you'll be able to actually speak with your reincarnation and me as well even after you die," he said nonchalantly. Iroh didn't know who Ashura and Indra were, but he supposed that it was knowledge best kept to his quests. Information about the world they had come from served him no purpose, despite how interested he may be. Naruto seemed to consider for a moment, but no longer than that. "Alright Kurama, I trust you. How do we do this?" he asked. Kurama finally stood up on all 4 legs and walked closer to Naruto. "Easy, just stand still and clear your mind. Should be quite simple for you," he added cheekily, a strange smile dancing on his vulpine lips before his face took on a sad expression. "We won't be able to communicate like we used to," he began, his tone strangely solemn. "The only way you'll be able to contact me is through deep meditation, though it is possible that we could establish some form of constant communication in a few years. But don't get your hopes up though." Naruto seemed to deflate slightly, but his cheery mood overcame such thoughts quickly. "Doesn't matter," he said, kneeling down and placing a hand on Kurama's head, only to have it swatted away quickly causing him to chuckle. "I'll know you're there and that's all that mattered to me." Naruto stood up and walked a few paces away from Kurama before turning and spreading his arms out wide, exposing his bare chest. "Come on then, let's do it Kurama," he called out, causing his friend to smile widely and break out into a run. Kurama closed the distance between them quickly, and when he was no more than 2 or 3 meters from Naruto, he leapt. Golden wisps of energy flared across his form mid-flight, his body quickly turning from short red fur to pure golden light, his form illuminating the early morning with a warm radiance. Iroh could feel the life energy pouring from the soaring fox, as it now seemed to be flying, rather than leaping towards its intended target. The moment Kurama's fingertips brushed against the bare skin of Naruto's chest, the fate of the 2 beings was sealed. The golden spirit's body was absorbed into Naruto's, Kurama forever disappearing into his friend to merge his spirit with the child who had freedom of his hatred. Kurama was quickly gone from view, the merging taking only the briefest of moments. Naruto's feet dug into the ground as he was pushed backward some 5 meters by Kurama's impact, his feet digging small trenches in the soft dirt. Iroh saw the boy double over in what looked like pain, holding his stomach with both arms tightly. Iroh wanted to help but knew there was nothing he could do, he had to let the process run its course. Naruto threw his head back quickly, his arms flying to his sides, and let loose a loud roar of pain. Iroh could only watch in morbid fascination as 9 distinct black markings began to sear themselves into the flesh of Naruto's chest, forming a half circle from shoulder to shoulder. For a brief instant Naruto seemed to radiate the same golden glow that Kurama had displayed only moments before. His body began to flicker between golden luminescence and normal teenager. Seconds later, his body exploded with light. Iroh was forced to throw his hands up to shield his eyes from the brightness. A long moment passed before Iroh was able to open his eyes again, what he saw filled his old heart with awe. Where Naruto had once stood there was now a figure wreathed in golden fire, wisps of the ethereal energy billowing softly from his arms and hair. Strange line markings had snaked their way over his body, expanding on the tattoos gifted to him by his original merging with Kurama. When Naruto slowly opened his eyes, Iroh was able to see that they were no longer the eyes one might expect to find on a man, but black animalistic slits resting upon the bright gold that had replaced the whites of Naruto's eyes. Naruto brought his hand up to his face and clenched his fist as a small experiment before a huge grin broke out on his face. He threw his head back, arms at his sides, and spun around as a loud whoop of enjoyment was thrown from his lungs. "This feels amazing," he called out as his piercing eyes found Iroh's. I can feel everything, the trees, the wind, the spirits all around us and the energy saturating the air. I can feel it all. Suddenly he thrust his arm outward, punching at the air, and a stream of bright orange flame was loosed into the air. Naruto's face showed his excitement at his newfound ability. Instinctively he thrust an open palm in the opposite direction in a gracefully fluid motion, and a powerful gust of air blew across the open grass plain surrounding Iroh's home. Naruto raised his hands and stared at them intently for a moment before looking over at Iroh. "This power, it's dangerous, very dangerous," he said before he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. His golden form disappeared in the blink of an eye, replaced with his original self. The 9 marks now seared into his skin looked red, raw and painful. He slowly made his way over to stand directly in front of Iroh before he pressed a fist into an open palm whilst bowing low. "Please teach me how to control it," he asked graciously. Though Iroh had only known Naruto for close to half a day, he was certain he had never felt so proud since the day his nephew Zuko had stumbled into his tent before Sazen's comet. He mirrored Naruto's action before placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "It would be my honor." Naruto spent 6 full months training in firebending with Iroh in the spirit world. As disappointed as he was that he would have to wait to begin mastering airbending, he was glad to have a teacher as wise as Iroh. During his stay he befriended many of the spirits that called the area around Iroh's tea shop home. His newly dubbed spirit mode was another story, however. After more than a few failed attempts to re-enter the powerful state, Naruto had decided that it could wait. The power he wielded in that form almost frightened him, and he wanted to master his newfound abilities before attempting to control the force of nature that he became when entering spirit mode. Naruto had only received one small communication from Kurama since their merging, knowledge of how he would be able to leave the spirit world despite the portals being sealed. From what Kurama had been able to communicate, it would be a one-time deal. If he ever wanted to enter the spirit world again, it would have to be via meditation, and even then only his spiritual self would cross over. Since his old clothes had been annihilated when he first entered the spirit world, Naruto had managed to scrounge together a new outfit from what Iroh had laying around his house. He now wore a slightly tattered orange robe with elbow-length sleeves and a tight brown wrapping around his waist. His forearms were covered in bandages with only the tips of his fingers being visible. He had found a plain pair of brown trousers and managed to make himself a pair of tight form-fitting grey boots. And Google Avatar 1, the older version with a small beard, just take away the red scarf. Naruto had tried his hardest to recreate his subconscious ability to fly, but found it fruitless. Iroh had mentioned that an ancient airbending master was supposed to have discovered the secret of flight, but all information on the man would only be found in the material world, much the same as a living airbending master for Naruto to learn from. The day of his departure had arrived far too quickly for Naruto's liking, but he knew deep down that it was time to leave and continue his training. Naruto stepped out of the building he had called home for the past 6 months to see Iroh seated at his tea table surrounded by a multitude of spirits, many he had come to know by name, such as Mei Jim. They had all come to say goodbye to one of the only humans to truly appreciate spirits. On the table beside Iroh sat a raggedy old shoulder bag that seemed full to bursting with different items. Iroh felt great pride as he watched Naruto walk towards his little tea party. He had trained the boy well in the art of firebending, as well as teaching him all he could of the world he would soon be living in. Naruto had taken to firebending like a prodigy despite his natural element being air. His movements were graceful, much the same as Iroh's, and not aggressive as many firebenders tended to be. Despite his rigorous training regime, Iroh had not taught Naruto all he knew of firebending. There were some secrets to the art that were not his to teach, though he was certain that he would learn them in time. Naruto stopped in front of Iroh and gave a slight bow before embracing the elderly man in a tight hug. "Thank you for all you've taught me, Iroh. If you hadn't found me that day, I don't know what would have happened to me," he said whilst smirking. "Think nothing of it, my boy, you are welcome here anytime, I hope you know that," said Iroh, gesturing to the many spirits surrounding them. "Your friends here will miss you as well, I'm afraid." He chuckled. Iroh turned and grabbed the old bag from the table behind him. "Now, before you go, I have a few parting gifts for you," he said as he reached into the bag, pulling out a well-worn map, its edges chipped and browned. Iroh carefully unfurled the map, showing it to be a very detailed map of the world. Laying it down on the table, he motioned Naruto to come closer. "This will be your first destination," he said, indicating a small island north of what Naruto now knew to be the Fire Nation mainland. "I ask that you be very respectful when you visit this place, the people there have much to teach you about firebending." Naruto nodded sagely. "Sure, I can do that," he assured his teacher. Iroh reached back into the bag, this time removing an envelope and small round object. "After you've visited the island, make your way to the Southern Water Tribe, which is where the White Lotus is training the new avatar. Present this at the gate," he said as he handed Naruto the White Lotus Pai show tile. then ask to see the Grand Lotus and give him this. Iroh explained before handing Naruto the envelope. That should allow you to join the order if you still wish to, said Iroh, earning a vigorous nod from his newest student. You bet. From everything you've told me of the order, it sounds like the perfect place for me. Plus I'll get to meet the Avatar, sounds like someone who would be a good sparring partner, said Naruto excitedly. Iroh chuckled at Naruto's eagerness, knowing that he had been waiting for the day he would get to explore the material world for many weeks. Though he was sad to see the young man go, Iroh knew that Naruto's place was no in the spirit world, he had a greater calling, and if he helped him achieve that then he would be more than content. Well then, he said, repacking Naruto's small bag and taking him by the shoulder, guiding him to an open area away from the tea table. I think it's time you were off, Naruto, you have things to do and places to be. Ought to be young again. Once again Naruto gave a gracious bow before sending all of the spirits a long wave. I'll see you guys again soon, that's a promise of a lifetime. He called out. Naruto sat down cross-legged in a meditative position and prepared himself for the journey to the material world. He looked up into Iroh's face one last time. Thank you, Iroh. Truly. He said before closing his eyes and allowing Kurama's spiritual energy to well up inside of him. Goodbye spirit world, he thought, I'll be back. And in a flash, he was gone. The sensation of falling was not one Naruto was fond of. He didn't know what to expect from his transportation from the spirit world to the material world, but falling from well over 300 meters in the air towards the ocean was not something he wanted at all. 6 months ago, Naruto knew for a fact that he would be screaming his head off in his current situation, but it wasn't 6 months ago, and Naruto was not the same person he was back then. He quickly adjusted his body weight to stop himself tumbling out of control and thrust both fists downwards at his side. 2 bright jets of flame burst into existence illuminating the night sky. His rapid descent was slowed almost immediately. To slow himself to a more manageable speed, Naruto willed matching flames to ignite from his feet, which gave him much more control of his movement. On the edge of the horizon Naruto could make out the vague outline of a landmass, though it was much too far away from his to glide there even with his fire rockets. Though he was no fond of the idea, Naruto knew he would have to swim most of the way. He only hoped he would be spared from any encounters with one of the outlandish animals Iroh had described to him in his studies. Naruto quickly decided that when he found a teacher for airbending, he would dedicate his time to finding out how he had managed to fly in his sleep, if only to save himself from annoying situations like the one he now found himself in. The sea came up to meet him far sooner than he would have liked, catching Naruto in its icy embrace. Naruto was well aware of the chance of hypothermia, but during his training, Iroh had stressed the necessity of proper breathing exercises. He had said it was often the one thing that would keep a firebender from death in extreme circumstances. Naruto was confident in his ability to keep his body warm even under such chilly conditions. The swim itself only took Naruto a little over 10 minutes, his athletic body allowing him to make good time in the water, despite the weight of his clothes, form-fitting though they were. He was glad to make the shallows safely and began the trek up the pristine beach towards the tree line. He decided he would wait until daybreak to explore the island and set about making a small fire pit on the edge of the tropical forest ahead of him. He sat cross-legged in the sand and began to exude as much heat from his body as was safe. The water soaking his clothes soon turned to steam and drifted away lazily in the cool night breeze. Naruto stripped down to the waist, his body sweat soaked from his muggy clothes, and was about to try and get some measure of sleep when he felt it. It was like a whisper on the air, the feeling tugging at the edges of his senses, teasingly like it had a mind of its own. If Naruto had to guess he would say it was almost as if it was calling to him, pleading him to find its source. Naruto wasn't sure exactly what possessed him to listen, but he did. He left his clothes and bag by his fire to dry, confident that they would be safe from thieves, and made his way into the forest in search of whatever was calling to him. The jungle was thick and Naruto found it hard going, but he persevered and he was soon rewarded. Suddenly and without warning the jungle around him simply vanished, ending so suddenly and with such precision that it startled him somewhat. Dirt gave way to aged yellow stone, and looking ahead of him, Naruto was awestruck with what he saw. Stretching out for as far as he could see was what appeared to be an ancient city, now full into ruin, but still strangely intact for the most part. Naruto stood at what he guessed was the beginning of a main thoroughfare, which led towards the center of the ruined city, to a massive stone structure, its top capped with gold that shone brightly under the full moon high above. Naruto could practically feel the spiritual energy that soaked the air around him, and he instantly knew that he was on the right track. Following the thoroughfare Naruto was led deeper and deeper into the city, all the while admiring the strange architecture that surrounded him. His carefree attitude almost proved fatal. Naruto was staring at the summit of the large structure ahead of him, he felt certain he could make out a faint light from its peak. He almost didn't hear the soft click from underneath his foot. His instincts kicked in not a second too late, launching him into the air mere moments before a large circular blade erupted from the wall beside him at waist height. Another appeared in the space Naruto occupied in the air, and he was forced to employ a rapid burst of fire from his palms, sending him towards the ground rapidly. Naruto quickly laid himself down flat as the first blade made a second pass overhead before disappearing into the wall that it first emerged from, its higher sibling following suit. Naruto cursed himself for his lack of awareness as he climbed back to his feet, though the shinobi in him had nothing but praise for whoever designed the trap itself. It must have been centuries, maybe even millennia old, and still it was working in perfect condition. Naruto vowed to pay less attention to the buildings around him and more to making sure he reached the central structure alive. It was another 10 minutes before Naruto was faced with a daunting flight of incredibly steep steps. A small groan escaped his tired lips before he began his ascent. The central structure was much taller than he had first anticipated, the ground was beginning to disappear below him. After what seemed like an eternity of climbing, the stairs soon brought Naruto to a large flat area a third of the way up the structure, with separate staircases on either end of an enormous mural that looped upwards, leading towards what Naruto assumed was the peak of the structure. The mural itself gave Naruto pause for a long moment. It depicted a strangely dressed man wreathed in a ring of fire that was being spewed forth from the mouths of two dragons, mirroring the other's position so as to be looking up towards the man himself. There was also a multitude of other symbols dotted over the mural, but most were far too faded from Naruto to make any sense of them. The only words he could make out were Sun Warriors, and the sudden realization almost took Naruto's breath away. Iroh had taught him much about the Sun Warriors. How they were the first humans to master the art of firebending by learning it directly from the first true firebending masters, the dragons themselves. Through some unbelievable stroke of luck Naruto had been deposited onto the very island Iroh had wanted him to seek out, he just knew it. Naruto quickly deduced that the mural depicted some form of ceremony in which the sacred knowledge of fire was passed from dragon to man. As fascinating as the mural was, Naruto knew that he would have to go higher. When he was finally able to tear his gaze away from the mural he began his climb anew, aiming for whatever lay at the structure's peak. The climb upwards from the mural was a much quicker one, and when Naruto reached the top of the stairs, he was confronted with a rather intimidating sight. Directly in front of him stood a strange column of marked stone, at its top, a marvelous red jewel was embedded in what appeared to be some form of ceremonial stone figurehead. The head was one of the largest ores Naruto had ever seen, what more it seemed to be made entirely of gold. It too sported a matching jewel above its circular form. Behind the box-shaped structure ahead of him Naruto could now plainly see a steep narrow staircase that led up to a small temple which formed the peak of the massive stone structure. Whilst its golden capped peak was still clearly visible, it was the bright orange glow of what could only be a large fire that drew Naruto's attention. Carved into the ground between the column and the golden door was what Naruto could only assume to be a celestial calendar, the distinct markings giving it away. Using knowledge Iroh had imparted to him, Naruto surmised that the two jewels were supposed to work in conjunction with each other and the calendar he now stood on. Naruto could remember mentioning that a similar device was employed in the temple of a past avatar, only allowing entrance to the inner chamber during a solstice. Whilst Naruto truly had no idea when the next solstice was scheduled to occur, he knew without a doubt that he wasn't going to sit around and wait for it. He deftly picked his way up the stone column, easily finding the handholds necessary to help him reach what would be the sun-facing side of the jewel. Hoping his plan would work, Naruto placed his open palm inches away from the surface of the jewel and attempted to produce the brightest flame he could muster. It seemed to work as Naruto noticed a pale red circle of light dancing across the far wall, though it was meters away from the opposite jewel and far too dim. Naruto carefully adjusted the angle of the light until it was resting upon the jewel above the golden door. In a brilliant flash of red light Naruto forced the flame in his palm to burn brighter and brighter, sweat beading on his furrowed brow from the exertion. Seconds later he was rewarded for his efforts. The jewel above the golden door glowed brightly, and the ground itself began to tremble as the massive door divided into two halves and parted to allow Naruto entrance into whatever chamber the Sun Warriors had gone through so much effort to protect. He dropped from the column, bracing himself for the long drop, dusted himself off and made towards the open doorway, eager to see what lay inside. The chamber itself was not on the grand scale as the rest of the architecture surrounding it, but it was not less impressive. It was a relatively small circular chamber, moonlight filtered down from a metal grate in the ceiling, illuminating a matching set of imposing statues that formed a ring-around room. The statues themselves caught Naruto's attention. They seemed to be demonstrating the positions of some form of ancient sun warrior firebending form, though it was not one that appeared even remotely familiar to him. Upon closer inspection Naruto noticed a series of indented plates in the floor in front of each statue and a small plaque that simply said the Dancing Dragon. Taking a gamble, Naruto stood before the first of the statues and imitated the position, balancing on one foot with his arms outstretched at shoulder height, his palms facing upwards. He could feel himself sink slightly into the floor and look down to notice he was right. The small plates in the floor that followed the statues were meant to be activated by following the positions of the statues. Naruto smiled and continued to move himself into the various positions of the dancing dragon style, arcing towards the back end of the room. When he finished the movements, Naruto could honestly say that he expected something mildly excited to happen. He was disappointed to learn that whatever mechanism the floor plates activated seemingly needed a second person moving in tandem with the first to work properly. More than a little let down, Naruto gave the statues one last glance before making his way out of the chamber. Remembering the staircase that led up to the small temple which seemingly housed a lit flame, Naruto made his way around the statue chamber and began to ascend the final staircase to the structure's peak. When Naruto reached the top of the stairs and set foot into the ancient Sun Warrior temple, he was almost left breathless. The temple itself was open to the elements with only a single wall towards the far end of the sudden plateau. Large stone columns supported the immense weight of the roof high above his head. The far wall was also decorated by various artworks, mostly depicting dragons and what Naruto now assumed to be Sun Warriors. All of the Sun Warriors shown on the wall seemed to be bowing to what stole Naruto's attention. An alcove, twice as tall as Naruto, was the centerpiece for the far wall. A huge magnificent flame burned brightly from within, casting a warm light across the floor of the temple. Naruto felt at once that the fire before him was not one made by man, it was ancient, incredibly so. The flame itself seemed to exude spiritual energy, and Naruto guessed it was the fire that was saturating the air in the ruined city with a strange sense of warmth. Despite himself, Naruto yawned loudly, his recent exertions finally taking their toll on his consciousness. He couldn't think of a better place to sleep than directly before the fire. Naruto sat cross-legged in a meditative position, his palms pressing against each other in front of his chest. Iroh had taught him many meditative techniques, one of which was the ability to enter a trance-like state, allowing his body to rest and recuperate, but still allow his spiritual self to remain active. Naruto had found that he was quite proficient in projecting his spiritual body, which would allow him to explore the rest of the city whilst his body slept. He felt his body go numb before the strange sense of weightlessness hit him, and he was suddenly looking down on his own body. No matter how many times he performed the act, it still freaked him out a little. Naruto descended the stairs he had only moments ago finished climbing. He was eager to explore at least a small portion of the city by daybreak, though he knew he only had a few hours at best. The sun was high in the sky when Naruto felt the tug rising from the pit of his stomach. It was close to midday, and he felt certain that something was wrong. While he was no more than 100 meters or less from the top of the stone structure, Naruto was forced to cancel his spirit walk prematurely, blasting his spiritual self back into his physical body. Forcing an end to the technique always made him feel queasy, but he was glad he had done it. His eyes shot awake in an instant, his stiff body cracking upwards to attention in the blink of an eye. A strangled gasp escaped his lips before Naruto was on the defensive. While his spirit was away, his body had been surrounded by a large group of strangely dressed men and women, some who brandished rather intimidating spears, whilst others casually held a small flame in their palm. It took Naruto's mind a moment to recognize his would-be captors. "You're the Sun Warriors," he exclaimed breathlessly, a grin creeping onto his face. "This is awesome." The group surrounding him parted to allow a slim elderly man pass, heading towards Naruto. He was dressed differently than the other Sun Warriors. Where their outfits were minimalist, consisting of only pants and a top for the women, he wore a ceremonial robe of deep orange. A strange headdress sat atop his head that appeared to be made of some kind of feathers. He also wore a large gold plate necklace that covered his neck completely. He hobbled along rather slowly, with the assistance of a staff topped with a golden flame cut out. As he drew closer, he studied Naruto with a critical eye, looking him up and down, and gave a small tut of annoyance. "I am Ham Gao, chief of the Sun Warrior tribe. You will tell me what you are doing here in our city or you will be punished severely," came the wispy voice of the elderly chief. Naruto didn't want to have to resort to violence, even to protect himself, but he knew that his best chance was to be respectful. Naruto faced the man head-on and bowed low to show his respect. "My apologies, I had not thought to meet anyone. I wasn't aware that I was intruding, I am sorry," he said, and it seemed to lessen the glare he was receiving from the chief somewhat. "I was told to seek out this island, to learn from its inhabitants, but I never expected to find the remnants of the Sun Warrior civilization still alive. I have come only to learn and nothing more," he explained. The chief's brow shot upwards at his statement. "You were sent here? By whom?" he asked warily. "Iroh, the dragon of the west, he sent me," announced Naruto, earning more than a few whispers from the group around him. "Do not take me for a fool, boy, Iroh has been dead for decades. spat Ham Gao, and Naruto shook his head. His body is dead, yes, but he lives on in the spirit world. He trained me in the modern art of firebending, and I think he sent me here in hopes that you would teach me the true way of fire. He explained. Please, teach me. Pleaded Naruto, and the old chief's face softened somewhat before he let out a long sigh. So be it. He said. It is not my place to decide whether you are worthy. The chief moved past Naruto, the group of sun warriors shifting so as to be behind Naruto and closer to the stairs. Ham Gao stopped in front of the large fire and turned to face Naruto. If you wish to learn the ways of the sun, you must learn them from the masters Ran and Shaw. Began the chief as if reading from some ancient script. When you present yourself to them, they will examine you, they will read your heart, your soul and your ancestry. If they deem you worthy, then you will gain the knowledge you seek, but if they don't, you'll be destroyed on the spot. He said, and Naruto was starting to have second thoughts, but quickly pushed them down. He had come too far to back out now. Besides, Iroh wouldn't have sent him to the Sun Warriors if he didn't believe Naruto would be able to pass whatever test they gave him, at least that was what he told himself. Ham Gao gestured behind him to the beautiful flame that burned brightly behind him. If you are still set on the masters killing you, then you must bring them a piece of the eternal flame. He began. This fire is the first one to burn in all of history. It was gifted to man by the dragons thousands of years ago. We have maintained our vigil and kept it burning since it was first breathed into existence. Naruto was awestruck by the significance of what he was being told. The first fire ever. He thought, that's so cool. You will have to take a piece of it to the masters to show your commitment to the sacred art of firebending, said Ham Gao before he turned to face the fire, his frail hands extending out gracefully and pulled at the air close to the flame. A thin stream of the eternal flame broke off from the hole into his hands, forming a small ring of fire. Despite his age, Ham Gao moved his body with such fluidity that it surprised Naruto, his movements reshaping the fire into a ball of flame no bigger than his closed fist. The Sun Warrior chief extended his hand out towards Naruto, offering him the flame, who bowed before taking the proffered fire in his palm. Instantly Naruto felt the difference. The flame he held in his hand was calm, it almost felt alive. His usual firebending was what Iroh had taught him, power given form, but this was so different that it almost felt like bending another element altogether. Why hadn't Iroh taught him this? This is not just some useless show, said Ham Gao, this ritual demonstrates the key ideals of Sun Warrior philosophy. You must maintain a constant heat, the flame will go out if you make it too small. Make it too big, and you might lose control. He explained. Ham Gao raised his arm, directing Naruto's gaze out to the edges of the city and towards a massive mountain, its peak split into two distinct shapes. You must take the flame up there. The masters reside in that mountain. It is there that you will present them with your fire. He said, and Naruto was barely able to stop a groan from escaping his lips. He had had enough with climbing for a while. Despite his reservations, Naruto bowed once again, careful to keep tight control over the fragile flame resting in his palm, and began the long trek to the masters. The sun was close to set when Naruto found himself in a narrow chasm, the walls of the mountain beginning to close in around him. Throughout his climb up the mountain, Naruto had been deep in thought. His mind had wandered back to Iroh's teachings, that fire was power, the energy of his own body harnessed as a tool of attack or defense. Naruto knew Iroh was a peaceful soul, and he also knew that Iroh had never abused the power of firebending when he was alive, but that was always how he had explained it to him, power. Iroh had been reluctant about going into any further detail about the nature and inner workings of the art, always changing the subject. Naruto could very well understand the man's teachings. When he used his firebending, he always felt a great rush of energy, a scorching power blasting its way through his body. The fire he now held in his hands threw all of what he knew of firebending into disarray. The flame flickering above his palms did not feel like pure power, Naruto couldn't feel its destructive potential. It felt like life, like creation itself. It radiated peace and not hints of violence. There wasn't a doubt in Naruto's mind that Iroh had withheld some intimate knowledge from him, though from all he had encountered in the past 24 hours, he had a fairly good idea as to why. Naruto was broken from his thoughts when the mountain suddenly opened up, the setting sun blazing bright on the horizon. Taking a few steps forward, Naruto now found himself in an immense circular area, a huge mural of a stylized sun emblazoned onto the cut stone floor. The twin peaks of the mountain stood before him, the distance between them bridged by a long stone walkway, its halfway point marked by a steep set of stairs that ascended to a square platform. Naruto noticed two large cave mouths in the mountainside where the walkways met natural stone. The Sun Warrior tribe had formed a wide ring round the edges of the circular area, some were kneeling before ancient-looking leather drums, whilst most were standing at evenly placed intervals. Naruto saw Ham Gao, flanked by two Sun Warrior, one of which was bearing a huge hollowed horn over his shoulder, at the base of the stairs, and moved to meet him. The chief moved forward as well, stopping in the exact center of the circular area and waited for Naruto to approach him. "This place is amazing," muttered Naruto as he drew nearer to Hamgao. It seemed his words were heard because the chief's features developed a small smirk. "This place is one of the most sacred areas on this island, second only to the Shrine of the Eternal Flame," he said as he gestured up the stairs. "This is where you will face the judgment of the masters Ran and Shaw," he explained before turning back to face Naruto, his face incredibly serious. "You have come this far without complaint, outsider. I feel obligated to warn you that facing the masters could be incredibly dangerous for you. We will not look down on you if you decide to back out now," he said, muttering probably. As an almost silent afterward. "I can't back out now. I've never given up once in my life, I'm not about to start now. There is so much I want to learn from Ran and Shaw. This fire is unlike anything I've ever felt before," said Naruto as he gestured to the fire he held in front of himself. "I want to know its secrets." Hamgao nodded slightly at his words and motioned for Naruto to hold out his hands. When he did as instructed, the chief deftly thrust both hands into the flame Naruto held and quickly pulled from it two individual balls of flame before handing each off to a sun warrior who in turn gifted it to another that formed the circle around the area. When the first sun warrior of the outer circle received the flame, it was quickly converted into a spinning ring sustained by two outstretched arms. The rings of fire gradually spread around the circle as the sun warriors divided the fire up between themselves, and it was not long until the entirety of the area was ringed in fire. Naruto drew in a single sustained breath before looking straight into Hamgao's eyes. "I'm ready, please bring out the masters," he said, and the chief gave a small nod. "Chanters," his tired lungs screamed out. All around him the sun warriors that were sitting by their drums suddenly exploded into motion, beating their fists against them to create a rapid tribal tattoo. Naruto soon found himself beginning his climb up the daunting steps. From the corners of his eyes, he could see many women of the group bowing profusely, as if in reverence to some god, and it struck Naruto as odd. He was only about to meet two firebending masters, he was beginning to wonder why there was so much pomp and ceremony. Halfway up the stairs, Naruto nearly stopped dead in his tracks. He could feel something deep below him, some presence that he could not attain the identity of. Whatever it was, it felt ancient, incredibly so. Through sheer force of will he made himself continue climbing. His confidence in his abilities soon returning, whatever it was he was about to face, it would be facing him head-on. When Naruto finally reached the top of the stairs and stepped onto the platform, the chanting and drum beats below suddenly dying out completely. A heavily amplified voice exploded into the air, and when Naruto looked down, he noticed that it was the man who had been carrying the massive horn. "He who seeks to meet the masters Ran and Shaw will now present his fire." Naruto's head darted from side to side quickly, staring into each cave mouth, but he faced only darkness from within. An idea quickly became known in his mind, and Naruto made his best effort to mimic Hamgao's actions from only moments ago. Turning gracefully on the spot, Naruto separated his single flame into two, holding one above each palm. He extended his arms outwards, one hand facing each cave, and bowed his head slightly, ready for whatever he was about to face. "Sound the call," shouted Hamgao, his voice reaching Naruto as clear as day. There was a slight pause before Naruto had what he could only guess was the sound of an immense signaling horn, the low drawn-out note piercing the strange calm that had settled upon him. For a moment nothing happened, and then the earth came to life around him. The two mountain peaks shook fiercely, large pieces of rock dislodging and tumbling down the sheer cliff face to the ocean below. The momentary feeling of fear almost caused Naruto's fire to extinguish itself, but he held firm. The shaking of the mountain intensified for a brief moment, and Naruto was awestruck when an enormous blue dragon burst from the cave to his right, soon followed by yet another dragon from the left, this one a rusty red color. The awesome creatures began circling the platform diagonally in perfect tandem. Naruto could have sworn that he saw the dragons look directly at him. Though he could not see it, down below the entirety of the Sun Warrior tribe was now prone on the floor, in a sign of respect to the beautiful creatures now soaring overhead. Naruto could only stare at the dragon circling him for the first few moments, part of his mind too awestruck after realizing that these dragon must be the first to teach man the art of firebending, before he noticed something odd. They weren't just flying along a designated route. There was a strange familiarity in their movements. Naruto smiled when he finally noticed that the dragons themselves were performing the dragon dance. Naruto hadn't even noticed that his two flames had completely disappeared when he began to follow the movements of the dragon dance. As he moved through the stances, he immediately noticed that the dragon's actions now mirrored his in their own way. Naruto was filled with a feeling of immense joy and peace, the graceful steps of the dance calming him. Time seemed to slow, dragging on for what felt like an eternity. Despite the complexity of the aerial maneuvers the dragon were performing, Naruto noticed that their eyes never left him, studying him with their ageless wisdom. It was an entirely humbling and at the same time terrifying thought. Naruto almost didn't notice that he had actually completed the dragon dance, his mind had seemed to wander towards the end, thoughts of the dragons and strangely, the feeling of the eternal flame mixed together with little coherence. Now the dragon were hovering mere meters above the walkway connecting their two caves, one either side of Naruto, they were both staring intently at Naruto. Both sported terrifying looks of rage on their scaly visages. The seconds continued to drag on, vicious snarls escaping from the fanged maws of Ran and Shaw. Without warning they dropped from the air and fell tail first before they latched onto the side of the large staircase so that they were looking upon Naruto from below, the perfect synchronicity of their actions impossible to miss. Their heads reared back for a brief moment and a terrible feeling formed in Naruto's gut, they were going to burn him alive. His assumptions were somewhat correct. Ran and Shaw thrust their heads upwards, their mouths opening wide and revealing a dull orange glow, quickly making its way up their throats before fire began to spew forth. On reflex Naruto closed his eyes and brought his arms up to protect his face. When he felt no searing pain he opened his eyes inquisitively and was struck motionless at what he bore witness to. A vortex of rainbow-colored flame swirled around him and up into the sky, the flame accented with bright yellows, deep purples and vibrant greens. There was a message hidden in the beauty of the flame, something that spoke to Naruto in such a way that he felt he had been blind all of his life and only now could he truly see. Fire isn't just power and destruction, it's also life and creation, harmony. He thought. The pure spiritual energy that the flames exuded was almost suffocating to Naruto's senses. Without truly understanding the significance of his actions, Naruto reached out with his own spiritual energy, his own life force, and connected himself with that of the rainbow fire. Some subconscious and more than likely irrational part of his mind fell into an old but practiced routine and began to draw the energy into himself. It was too late when Naruto realized what he was doing. From his bound position Ham Gao stared up with a small smirk on his lips at the outsider. The masters had in fact deemed him worthy, much to his own surprise. He had not witnessed the sight of the master's rainbow flames for many decades, not since Avatar Aang and Fire Lord Zuko had come seeking the truths of firebending. Though he had only witnessed one true ceremony he knew something was wrong. Ran and Shaw had ceased producing their brilliant flame and yet still the vortex of multicolored flame remained in the air, wreathing the outsider in its warmth. The masters themselves remained on their perch, staring intently where the outsider would have been standing. Many moments of awed silence passed before the top of the vortex began to unravel, seemingly drawn into its center. The process continued rapidly, and soon Ham Gao could see the source of the strange events and gasped out loud despite himself. Where the outsider had once stood, ready to be judged, there was now a being of golden radiance. The rainbow flames were being absorbed through the being's arms and what Ham Gao could only assume would be its mouth and eyes. The vortex was reduced to wispy funnels of flame that quickly disappeared into the golden figure. When the last of the flames were gone the outsider, for the figure could be no one else, staggered for a brief moment before dropping to his knees, the golden light that suffused his body disappearing in the blink of an eye. Bran and Shaw remained in place for a moment longer before taking to the sky and once again disappearing into their mountain home. With the ritual done the Sun Warriors stood up as one, all of them confused and awed in equal measure. Murmuring soon broke out amongst the group and Ham Gao was forced to call for silence. The outsider was coming down the stairs. When Naruto regained any true sense of self, he found himself on his knees with one hell of a headache. On some level he partially understood what had happened. The familiar feeling of the spiritual energy given off by the rainbow flames felt so much like nature chakra that some part of him acted on impulse and began absorbing the present energy. Groggily Naruto regained his footing and looked down below, noticing that Ran and Shaw were both absent, most likely already having returned into the mountain. He also noticed that the Sun Warriors had all gathered below at the base of the stairs. Deciding that he had accomplished his goal, Naruto began his shaky journey down the stairs, silently praying his tired legs didn't give out under him and send him tumbling downwards looking like a fool. Ham Gao seemed to have dispersed the majority of the Sun Warriors by the time Naruto reached the bottom. That was amazing. The flames, it was like they spoke to me, my firebending feels so much more. Complete now. Said Naruto as he sported a massive grin. His carefree manner seemed to put Ham Gao somewhat at ease. I would hope so. The masters deemed you worthy and through their fire, showed you visions of what firebending truly is. Said the chief and Naruto nodded in response. Yes, it isn't just power, it's life and energy. I now know why Iroh didn't teach me this himself, he knew it was something I had to be taught firsthand by Ran and Shaw. He said before he stepped to the side of Ham Gao and performed a movement of the dragon dance. Naruto nearly fell over in shock. From his outstretched hand shot a constant stream of rainbow fire, identical to that of Ran and Shaw. Ham Gao seemed similarly taken aback, his staff clattering to the stone floor loudly. How did you do that? No human has ever produced the fire of the masters. He said, his shock evident in his tone. Naruto could only stare at his hands when he spoke. I don't really know, it just feels natural, I'm not even trying to replicate their fire, I'm just producing it naturally. He said, still trying to process things himself. It must have something to do with what happened to you up there. Said Hamgao, and Naruto suddenly had a vague idea as to what had happened. Did I start glowing? He asked simply. He only received a confused nod from the Sun Warrior chief. Kurama must have triggered spirit mode when I accidentally started absorbing Ran and Shaw's spiritual energy. I'm guessing that he found a way to mix mine with theirs, turning my fire rainbow as a result. He explained, though he himself was confused with the specifics. Who is Kurama? Asked Hamgao, a look of confusion plastered across his face. Oh, Kurama is the spirit that merged with me back in the spirit world. When I gather or expel enough spiritual energy, I can enter what I call spirit mode. That's what you saw me do, my body is coated in golden fire for as long as my spirit mode is active. Said Naruto, only causing Hamgao even more confusion. You know what? He said as he covered his face with a hand, I'm not even going to ask. Naruto scratched the back of his head and smiled in embarrassment. A moment of silence passed between them before Hamgao called out to a Sun Warrior behind him. Naruto saw that the man that came forward was carrying everything that Naruto had left at the beach the night before. The Sun Warrior stopped before Naruto, bowed, and handed Naruto his possessions. Ah, thanks I guess. Saves me the trouble of going back to get them, I suppose. He said as he dressed himself. It is time for you to leave. Said Hamgao. My people have prepared a small boat as well as supplies for you to take with you. I noticed your map you carried had both our island and the southern water tribe circled. I assume you were going to be making your way there after you finished here. He asked. Yes, Iroh asked me to come here first before I headed south. Thank you for the boat, I kind of got here by falling, so I didn't want to have to swim all of the way there. Said Naruto as he laughed. Hamgao only gave him a blank stare, not even bothering to ask him what he meant. Before you leave here you must make me one simple promise. He said. Anything? Was Naruto's immediate response. You must never tell anyone about us or the masters. Make up some stupid lie about the color of your firebending. Said Hamgao. Naruto could both understand and respect the chief's desire for privacy, their culture was one that survived only on their anonymity. Naruto pressed a fist to his palm and bowed. You have my word, Hamgao, I won't tell anyone, that's a promise of a lifetime. He said whilst grinning. Naruto spent more than a few days sailing down the coast of the Fire Nation before he found a large port town. He was glad for the supplies provided by the Sun Warriors, the various dried meat sating his considerable appetite. Considering he hadn't eaten any real food for 6 months, it tasted amazing. Naruto pulled into port early in the morning, tying his boat up at a small dock before making his way into the town proper. Out in the harbor were more than a few large ships, a few of which looking a lot like merchant vessels, and Naruto hoped that at least one of them was heading to the Southern Water Tribe. He passed by many food stalls, the majority of which were selling all kinds of exotic-looking seafood, before he found what he hoped was the harbor master's office. When he entered, Naruto was confronted by a small elderly man sitting behind a large desk littered with various articles of paperwork. The man looked up at Naruto's entrance and eyed him quizzically, obviously not expecting visitors it seemed. What can I do for you, son? I'm a little busy. He said. I'm sorry to bother you, sir, but I'm hoping you could tell me if there are any ships headed for the Southern Water Tribe anytime soon. Asked Naruto in a pleading tone. The man stared at Naruto for a short moment before studying a small notebook on his desk. You're in luck, there's one heading out in a few hours, a Varric Industries ship. He said. Naruto sighed in happiness, he really didn't want to be stuck here for a week or two just waiting on a ship. Okay, thanks old man. How do I know which ship it is? He asked, causing the old man to huff. It's the fancy-looking white and blue ship at the end of the harbor, you can't miss it. He said. Naruto found the ship easy enough. Just as the harbor master had said, it was fairly easy to find. Seeing as he didn't have any money to his name, he was forced to sneak aboard, where he found a rather secluded spot in the cargo hold inside some sort of wheeled machine. It was a few hours before the ship rumbled to life and began to move and make for open sea. Naruto didn't know how long it would take to reach the Southern Water Tribe, but he hoped it was only a few days at most, he didn't have much dried meat left. As it turned out, the trip south only took 3 days, most of which Naruto spent in meditation to consume as little energy as possible. Naruto waited by the loading ramp until the door itself was only a half-meter open before he slipped out into possibly the coldest weather he had ever experienced. All around him was ice, even the buildings that he could see were all formed from the stuff. He quickly decided that it would be best for him to get as much distance from the ship he had stowed away on as soon as possible. Naruto made his way through the city, searching for any sign of the White Lotus, when something caught his eye. Through an open door, Naruto could see into what he assumed was what amounted to a bar in the Southern Water Tribe. His attention though was drawn more to a single patron that he caught a glimpse of. In the far corner of the building, Naruto could see an elderly man wearing blue and white robes sitting at a pie show table and calmly sipping from a cup of tea. Naruto quickly made his way inside and his suspicions were confirmed. The old man wore a thick white collar, its edges marked with a white lotus flower. Naruto sat at the table across from the old man, causing his brow to raise a little. "Now what can I do for you, young man?" he asked curiously. Naruto didn't answer, his hands dug through his small bag until he found what he was looking for. Casually, he placed the white lotus tile that Iroh had gifted him in the center of the table, causing the old man to choke a little on his tea, though he quickly regained his composure. "I see you favor the white lotus gambit, my boy, there aren't many who still follow the ancient ways," he said before he cupped his hands together, palms raised, and bowed to Naruto, who repeated the gesture. "Those who do can always find a friend," he said, mirroring the words Iroh had taught him months ago, secretly hoping he wasn't screwing something up in the process. The old man nodded softly. "Then let us play," he said before placing another tile down on the table. Naruto began matching pace with him, each of them placing another tile down after the other. In moments the board was complete, the place tiles resembling a large lotus flower with a white lotus tile in the center. The old man looked up and smiled. "Welcome, brother," he began. "The white lotus opens wide to those who know her secrets." Naruto laughed nervously. "Well, I'm not really a member, so to speak, but I want to be. The person who taught me this little game asked me to speak directly to the Grand Lotus, he was the one who told me that I would be able to find him here in the South Pole," he explained. "I see, that is most unusual," said the old man, seemingly deep in thought. "I suppose there would be no harm in you meeting him, after all, you do know one of our order's ancient customs. I have one condition though," he said. Naruto could barely contain his excitement, he had hoped that his forwardness wouldn't dissuade the man. "Name it," he said eagerly, and the old man smiled in response. "You'll have to have your head covered so you can't see where we are going, the location itself is considered somewhat secretive," he explained. "Fine by me," said Naruto. "When can we leave?" he asked. The old man smirked. "Right now," was his answer. Naruto made to stand before a black bag was thrown over his head from behind. Whilst the uncomfortable feeling of being deprived of sight was not one Naruto enjoyed, it was one he was willing to put up with if only for a short while. From what he could tell, there were at least 3 other men, along with the old man accompanying him. He wasn't quite sure where he was. He had been led from the bar with a black bag over his head, completely unaware of where the White Lotus members were taking him. He had heard the sound of metal on metal before he was hoisted up into something and down onto a rather uncomfortable metal seat. Steel doors closed behind him, and whatever machine he found himself in rumbled to life with a great shaking roar before it rumbled off into parts unknown. He had been at least an hour into his silent journey before someone began asking Naruto questions. He immediately recognized the voice as the old man he had confronted in the bar. "Who sent you to us?" he asked simply. "Who taught you the old ways of the White Lotus?" Naruto was unsure of how he should answer. Iroh had made it very clear that only the Grand Lotus should know of his continued existence. He would have to fabricate some sort of lie. "I come from a small village in the Fire Nation," he began. "I used to help out this old man with his fishing business, he was getting too old to do all of the heavy lifting himself, and I needed the money. One day a group of roaming bandits made their way into town, demanding any money or resources the people had. We were too small a village to have any sort of guard or garrison, we'd never had any trouble in the past, you see. A few years earlier a group of soldiers made their way through the town, they saw that I was a firebender, and the captain didn't think it was right to just let me be without any sort of training. After they left I began to train myself, building on what the soldiers had taught me. So when I saw all of those bandits just taking whatever they wanted from those weaker than them, I just couldn't stand it. I managed to scare them off, and afterwards the old man said that he admired how brave I had been, that he had something to show me. He eventually told me how he used to be a member of the White Lotus back in the days before Avatar Ong, and that I had displayed the courage and selflessness required of the order. At the time I didn't think much of it, just some old man recounting his glory days, but he kept teaching me more and more of what you guys represented, and I knew I had to join. The day he died, the old man said that I should seek out someone called the Grand Lotus, he said he was pretty much your leader. I figured that the Grand Lotus would be wherever the Avatar was being trained, but no one I asked had any idea where that was. I knew that the new Avatar was a waterbender, so I came here first hoping to meet someone from the White Lotus, and well, I found you," said Naruto, finishing his lie. The old man was silent for a moment, seemingly considering the young man's words. That was very astute of you, the Grand Lotus is indeed assisting in the training of Avatar Korra. You may have traveled a long way but it was not in vain. He said finally. Korra? So that's the Avatar's name? Asked Naruto excitedly. Ever since Iroh had explained to him just what the Avatar was, Naruto had been dying to meet them. Yes, she is currently attempting to master firebending, but I believe it will be more than a few months before she has anything in the way of mastery over the element. Answered the old man. Great, I can't wait to meet her. Said Naruto. Maybe I can give her a few pointers, I am the best firebender in the world after all. He said confidently, puffing his chest out as he crossed his arms over his chest, though to be honest, he wasn't sure how stupid the gesture looked with a bag over his head. Naruto heard the old man laugh warmly. I'm sure you are my boy. You might just get the chance, we're almost there. He said, and Naruto could feel someone reach for the bag over his head. Close your eyes, kid, he heard a man's voice say. It's pretty bright. He said, giving Naruto a moment before pulling off the bag. The man had been right, it was incredibly bright without the bag. Naruto quickly regained his vision, and he saw why. For as far as he could see was a great expanse of white, the snowdrift seeming to never end. The sun was high in the sky, and its fierce light reflected off of the icy ground. Naruto at his immediate surrounding and noticed that he was inside what he assumed was some form of snow transport. The cramped back cabin housed himself along with the old man, as well as another White Lotus member, how wore what looked more like armor than the robes the old man sported. The other two men he had felt were seated in the front cabin of the machine. Naruto looked out of the front window and saw their obvious destination. A large wall, seemingly made entirely of ice, sprouted from the endless expanse of snow. The only noticeable feature of the wall itself was the intricately carved gatehouse that was rapidly getting larger in his vision. This is our training outpost, said the old man. We have been training Avatar Korra here since we discovered her as a child. The gates now loomed over them, opening slowly on old hinges. Naruto was impressed with what he saw inside the compound. The large sparring arena dominated the center of the compound, with a sizable viewing platform, affording teachers the chance to watch their students fight up close. There were few buildings within the compound, numbering far less than 10. A single structure caught Naruto's eye. It wasn't grandly designed and it certainly wasn't large, but it was homely. The building itself sat in a secluded corner of the compound, far out of the way of usual attention. It seemed that it was to be their destination, the snow rider bringing them ever closer. Before long they were parked in front of the small house, and the old man was ushering Naruto from the vehicle. He pointed towards the front door which lay atop a small set of worn wooden stairs. The Grand Lotus is inside, he will meet with you, but please see this for what it is, a great honor, there are very few outside the order who have ever met the Grand Lotus. Treat him with respect and he will do the same to you. He explained simply and Naruto nodded. After triple checking that he did in fact still have Iroh's letter with him, Naruto made his way up the creaking stairs carefully and knocked on the door gingerly, as if afraid too much force would cause the entire structure to tumble. An aged voice was his only reply. Enter. It said. Naruto let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, opened the door and entered a new world. Naruto's meeting with the Grand Lotus had been brief, if a little chaotic. Naruto had not said a word to begin with, he had simply dropped Iroh's letter before the rather polite elderly man that sat before him and waited. He had expected his story to be ridiculed and mocked, but the Grand Lotus had remained fairly calm as he read the letter. Afterwards he had asked Naruto a series of rapid and pointed questions. Thankfully Iroh had neglected to mention that Naruto had come from an entirely different world, a small mercy he was grateful for as he had decided early on that it was best to never tell anyone of his true place of origin. In little under 10 minutes Naruto was out the door and on his way to what he had been informed would be his new accommodations, a small wooden hut that jutted out from the glacial drift that served as the rear wall of the compound. It was far more than he needed, Naruto intended to spend the majority of his time training and honing his skills, though the small but soft bed and shower were welcome. Naruto and Iroh had both decided that it would be better if no one knew of his ability to dual bend until he found an airbending master to teach him, though that hadn't stopped him training his mastery of wind in secret. The White Lotus entry that escorted him to his lodgings had informed him that a uniform would be brought to him in the morning, his duties were to begin the very next day. Though the knowledge that his vacation time had come to an abrupt end, Naruto was more excited than ever. The Grand Lotus had quickly decided upon his position within the order. Due to his age and what Iroh had labeled as likableness, Naruto would act as Avatar Korra's personal guard and training partner. Apparently the girl had been complaining of late as to the lack of younger company, and from what Naruto could tell, the Grand Lotus was happy to finally shut her up. Naruto had been itching to meet the Avatar, now he would get to train with her, firebending training to boot. Though he was certain that he was far above the average when it came to firebending, Iroh had quickly taught him that there was always something more to learn. He also hoped that he would finally be able to start work on his own firebending form. After his encounter with Ran and Shaw, Naruto had been inspired, wanting to merge what Iroh had taught him with the dragon dance, as well as some of the moves Guy and Lee had taught him back in the ninja world. He was more than confident that the finished form would be brutal, graceful and beautiful, all at the same time. Sighing, Naruto moved to lie down on his new bed, knowing that such thoughts would more than likely have to be postponed for some time. His new duties to the White Lotus would have to come first. Despite the extreme temperatures outside, his hut was rather warm, and he was more than a little glad for it. Naruto Uzumaki was not a fan of cold weather. Sleep came quickly for him, his mind wearing itself out with raging thought of what the new day might bring. Naruto woke early in the morning, well before sunrise. He was immensely grateful to have an actual bed under him. His lodgings inside the cargo ship had been less than ideal. Despite the early hour, a standard White Lotus uniform rested on a hook just inside his door. When it had been delivered, Naruto couldn't say. After a very quick meal of rather tasty porridge and honey, he decided on an early morning training session. Donning only the pants and boots of his new uniform before grabbing a thin shirt, Naruto braced himself and threw open the door, a gust of chilling wind his immediate companion. Pushing through the cold, Naruto made his way to the center of the compound towards the training ground he had spotted the day before. He was no stranger to training in extreme or dangerous conditions, but it had been months since he had experienced cold such as this. He saw more than a few sentries give him a strange glance before they went on their way. Before long he had reached his destination. Taking his shirt off slowly, careful to keep his body moving slowly so as to avoid any adverse effects from the cold, he sat in a cross-legged position in the center of the open area. Naruto began his breathing exercises, designed to help him regulate body temperature. They would enable him to perform the rigors of physical training despite the cold, without the dangers of cold-based injuries. Naruto knew that the style that he planned to create would require many weeks or even months of strenuous exercise to give him both the flexibility and bodily strength he would require. The sun was beginning to rise over the compound's gate when Naruto finally finished the second stage of his exercises, stretching. He quickly found that his regular breathing techniques were far more effective than they had ever been, and he could only guess that it was a result of his training with Ran and Shaw. He also found that the techniques taught to him by the Toad Sages of Mount Myaboku were also very effective for warm-up exercises. When he felt his body was ready, he began to flow through the opening movements of his basic firebending form, finding solace in the basics. He knew that the formation of an entirely new form wouldn't be someone that would happen overnight. He would have to work day in day out. Naruto smiled as he felt the heat within his own body surging through him, ready to be given form. Though he had felt the same way countless times in the last 6 months, it never ceased to amaze him. Bending is awesome. He thought with a smile on his face. As far as Korra was concerned, today was just any other day, boring and for the most part, uneventful. Her daily routine rarely ever changed. She would get up and dressed, feed Naga, and then for the rest of the day the White Lotus would effectively babysit the avatar in training, spoon-feeding her new bending knowledge, in hope of keeping her safe. Despite this, Korra would be the first to admit that her training could be fun at times. Especially when they would pit her against some of the newer White Lotus members, the feeling of utterly destroying them with her obvious skill was one she didn't think she would ever get used to. She had only begun firebending training a little over 9 months ago, having finally convinced the old coots that oversaw her training that she had effectively mastered both waterbending and earthbending. She knew that her trainers usually preferred her to arrive at least close to the allotted time, so she was forced to leave Naga in her den sooner than she would have liked. It was then that she noticed something was different. Usually she could spot 2 or 3 sentries along her usual route to the training ground, today though they were nowhere in sight. Up ahead she could make out the shapes of people running in the direction of the training ground. Knowing something was definitely happening, she too broke into a run to see what the commotion was about, eager for something to bring even a little bit of surprise to her somewhat dull life. She was not disappointed. There was a considerable crowd at the training ground, each person jockeying for position at the front. Though she couldn't make out the source, Korra could easily say what she could see was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen in her relatively short life. Great gouts of exotic fire burst into existence at rapid intervals, the vibrancy of the colors shocking some who saw them. Striking reds, bright yellows, vibrant greens, deep blues and beautiful purples, and countless other colors Korra had never seen before, all coalesced together to form one brilliant source of flame. She knew that she had to see just who it was that was controlling the flames, so she rather ungracefully began to shove his way to the front, earning more than a few angry glances that immediately withered as people noticed who it was that was bumping them around. It only took her a moment to make it to the front, and she was more than a little surprised by what she saw. In the center of the training ground was a teenager who looked no older than herself. She could make out his strange bright blonde hair as he flew through a series of intricate movements that Korra had never seen before. He was neglecting to use his hands almost entirely, instead using them to support himself as he spun his legs rapidly, bolts of rainbow fire blasting outwards from his feet with ferocious speed. He followed his spin with an overhead flip, bringing his right leg around for a complete revolution before landing upright. His movements came to an abrupt halt after one final move. His upper body pivoted sideways, completely independent of his legs, which he brought up moments later for a diagonal rotation with his right leg extended. When his foot came into contact with the ground, it began to slide, and for a horrible moment, Korra thought the boy had misplaced himself and was about to fall. Nothing bad came of it, however, as his foot slid across the smooth floor of the training ground, a wave of rainbow flame blossomed from his heel and spread across the ground. He came to a resting position with his body almost hugged the ground, his left leg was supporting his weight under him, whilst his right was outstretched completely, his right hand extended in a fist resting just above the corresponding foot. It was then that the applause erupted around Korra, the level of noise entirely out of place in the White Lotus compound. Instead of joining in, Korra found herself bounding across the open ground towards the teen. Only now did she notice that he was in fact completely stripped from the waist up, sweat beading on his toned chest as his body tried to come down from its recent high. Despite herself, Korra found herself blushing slightly and trying her best to avert her gaze, as well as regain her composure. He seemed to hear her approach, looking up and meeting her eyes. They were the bluest eyes she had ever seen. Her gaze was also drawn momentarily to the strange marks that he sported on each cheek, almost like whiskers. That was totally amazing. She shouted, still somewhat in awe of what she had seen only moments before. You've got to teach me how to do that rainbow fire trick, she said. The boy only scratched the back on his head in embarrassment, a huge grin on his face. Sorry about that, he chuckled, I guess I got a little carried away there. I didn't mean to cause such a fuss, I only wanted to get a little training in before everyone woke up, he said cheerfully. Oh, and the whole rainbow fire thing, he added as an afterthought, it's not something I can teach, as far as I know I'm the only one who can do it. Something unique about my Kai, at least that's what the White Lotus say, he explained. To say Korra was disappointed was an understatement, she couldn't imagine how cool she would look throwing around rainbow fire. Damn, she said, voicing her opinion, that would have been so cool to learn. Never mind that now though, what are you doing here if you don't mind me asking? The White Lotus doesn't really let a lot of people my age around here, they say it would just distract me from my avatar training, she said as she crossed her arms and pouted slightly. Korra could see a flash of recognition pass through the boy's eyes momentarily. You're Korra? He asked, receiving a small nod. Awesome, I've been looking forward to meet you for a while now, he said. Korra watched as he extended his fist out towards her, a smile on his face the whole time. The name's Naruto Uzumaki, and I'll be your training partner from now on. Korra quickly matched his smile with one of her own and smacked her own fist into his. It seemed today wasn't entirely uneventful after all. Finally it seemed she'd have some decent company to hang around with. Neither noticed the aged woman standing in the shaded area of the training ground, a motherly smile adorning her face. End chapter. So this part ends here. If you want to see next part of this series, like the video now and share the story with your friends. Bye bye.